let us begin with a word of prayer at this moment. Gracious and most merciful God, in whom we live, move, and have our very being, we are grateful for the gift that has been presented through the work of Michele Norris. And we ask, oh God, that you will allow us to take in not only the information, but that we may be lights to light a way for a new tomorrow. We are grateful for this time and for this conversation, and we just ask for your blessing at this moment. We offer this prayer in the mighty and the wonderful and blessed name of Jesus, who is the Christ. And the people of God who love God may say, Amen. It is my delight to welcome to Book Notes this evening someone I have admired for years, none other than Michele Norris. From 2002 to 2012, she was the host of NPR's All Things Considered. She has won a Peabody Award, an Emmy Award, was a writer for the Washington Post, and also created an incredible gathering, I should say a game, it's the race card game, that she was able to collect information all across the globe of how people view and see race and their identity, just in 6 words. And as a result of leaving these cards, literally, in different cities, people started writing and sharing their stories. It was first 6 words, but then people started giving the background and sharing pictures. And now we have an amazing mosaic of the way that people view identity, the way that people view race from all different perspectives, from those who are elders and from those who are young adults. And I want to welcome to our Book Notes conversation this evening none other than Michele Norris.
Pastor Moss, it's so good to be with you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you on Book Notes. I have so long admired your work. We get to spend time with each other. We have shared friends, and so I've gotten to know you over the years, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Sister Norris, you have been a blessing in the lives of so many people. And the book that you have created, I shared with the congregation last Sunday that everyone should pick up a copy of this book. And not only that, but have a conversation about all that is in this particular book. And I want to begin by asking a question. If you would just share, you have a really powerful story, actually two very powerful stories that I would like for you to articulate. One about your grandfather in Alabama, and the other about your grandmother, that during your writing career you had the opportunity to learn more about your own history and its connection with America's original sin.
I think you're referring to my father. There's a story about my grandfather also that
Yes.
I realized when I was the book that is sitting in front of you, Our Hidden Conversations, grew out of the first book I wrote, which was called The Grace of Silence. And the reason I called it The Grace of Silence, because so many of us, descendants of Africa, know so little about our families' histories. And it's not that they kept those histories from us for nefarious reasons. It's more that they didn't want to weigh us down with their disappointments and their difficulties. And so my mother is from Minnesota, 4th generation Minnesota. Both my parents are African American. They got to Minnesota very early, ahead of the Great Migration. I was raised in Minnesota. My father was part of the Great Migration. He came up from Birmingham, Alabama. And when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, something interesting started happening in my family, and maybe some of yours too. Thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening, and I'm wondering if you had this experience too, where the older people in the family started suddenly telling stories. Suddenly, they saw this man of color, this family of color moving into the White House, and it stirred something in them, and suddenly they were sharing things that they had never shared with us. And so in my family, I learned that my father, who was from Birmingham, Alabama, um, had been shot by a police officer in the leg while he was trying to enter a building. And if any of you are, it's Chicago, so some of you may have Birmingham roots because so many people in Chicago come from either Alabama or Mississippi. He was trying to enter uh, a building. It's called the Pythian Temple in the Fourth Avenue Business District in Birmingham, Alabama. And he had just returned from his military service, and he had fought for democracy overseas and came back like so many veterans did with the crazy idea that he would get a taste of democracy back home. So he was entering the Pythian Temple because that was where returning servicemen and women, because there were wax and waves also, some of them were women, most of them were men, were going there to learn as much as they could about the Constitution so they could register to vote. And when my father was trying to enter that building, a police officer tried to stop him. He was with his brother Woodrow and with a family friend named John who lived at two doors up the street on Avenue G in the Ensley neighborhood of Birmingham. And my father, who was a very mild-mannered, you would say by today's standards that he's very zen. He's gone to glory in 1988, so he's been gone for a long time. But I learned this story after he had died from one of my uncles, Joe Norris, who lived in Chicago on Phillips Avenue, down by Chicago Votech. And we were actually at a restaurant in Chicago called the Egg and I remember the name of this restaurant because my uncle Joe, who told me the story, was fussing at me because I had ordered some fancy omelet thing, and he thought it was, why are you spending all that money on food we could make at home? And uh, and he was also fussing because he had been spending the day. He had spent much of the previous year trying to register young men to vote, and he thought it was too hard. And he said to me, it shouldn't be this difficult. Your father was shot trying to register to vote. And I was shocked. He said, my father was shot. And I was shocked because I'd never heard the story. And then, Pastor, what I did is I went and I talked to all these relatives, and I called people in Birmingham, and I found other relatives in Chicago and distant cousins and second cousins that were of my father's generation. And they all knew about it. They just never talked to us about it. My mother didn't know about it. But what I learned was that my father was entering this building in the Pythian Temple to learn about the Constitution because in order to vote in Birmingham at that time, you had to prove that you fully understood the Constitution. And if you remember, do you remember that scene in Selma where Oprah Winfrey is playing Annie Lee Cooper and she goes to register to vote and they ask her how many judges are there? They ask her about the Constitution. She knows all the answers. But then they start to ask her about how many suds are in a bar of soap. They had no intention of letting her register, and that's what my father faced. And it turns out that he was wounded. I found the police reports about it, and I realized that he there was a scar on his leg. I remember that when I was young. He walked with a little bit of it wasn't a limp, but he had a little bit. He had a certain kind of stride, and I always just thought it was black man being a black man. That was just the way that he just put a little English in his walk, but now I realize that was a result of, what happened, and he never told me about it, and so that was one of the reasons, that I wound up writing this book about my family's complex legacy because I knew that I was not alone in carrying a legacy. It turns out my mother had secrets in her side of the family also, but they didn't tell us these stories because they wanted us to love a country that did not love them back. They wanted us to see ambition instead of anger. And there's so much grace in that, to withhold that and to withhold that from us. And I decided to go ahead and share the story because I wanted my own children to know this. I wanted to know where they came from, not so they would be angry at America, but so that they would be less likely to take for granted the America that they inherited and that they would understand. When my father died, all of those when you go to vote, those little "I voted" stickers that you get? When he died, in that little drawer in the dresser where you keep your cufflinks, and your special stuff. It's lined in velvet in your dresser. He had all of these little "I voted" stickers all around the edge of it. And it's never easy for me to talk about this, but when they lost their adhesive backing, he would use Scotch tape to, put them there. And now I understand why voting was so important to him. Now I understand why he kept that. And I wanted my kids to know that, so that they know that they have not just a right but a responsibility to participate in civic life in America.
What an extraordinary story. Thank you for giving just even a broader context for the story, because it was so powerful when I read it. First off, but thinking about a veteran twice over, a veteran of the war, but a veteran of another movement, the movement of human dignity. That he was a veteran twice over and had the medals. Hmm. That
Yeah.
he carried the medals. So thank you for sharing that. Tell the audience how this book, which is, by the way, that's the commercial time, Our Hidden Conversations, What Americans Really Think About Race and Identity. Tremendous publication.
Yeah.
Tell us how this came about. There's a structure to it.
Yeah.
And I'd love for the audience to hear the beauty of the structure and how it grew.
Well, when I wrote the first book, The Grace of Silence, I was still working at National Public Radio, and I was on sabbatical, and I was on a 35 city book tour. And I was out in America talking about my book, which was about my family's complex racial legacy. So I knew I was going to be having a conversation with people all over the country about race. I was hopscotching all over the place. Um, and at that time, I thought America doesn't want to talk about race because we were, if you remember, when Barack and Michelle Obama, President and First Lady Barack and Michelle Obama, first went into the White House, America was having a conversation about being post-racial, like as if it was over, like we weren't going to have a conversation about race. And I thought, well, people are in such a hurry to get to this post-racial positioning that they're not going to want to have to talk about race. So I had to figure out how I could invite people into the conversation because I actually wanted to have the conversation. I was listening when I was traveling across the country, and people seemed to be they had questions. They were having an animated conversation in secret. It just that they weren't having it in a public space. And so that's why I created this exercise that you mentioned, the 6-word exercise. I actually have one of the original cards right here. This is what they look like. I went to the Kinko's near my house, and I printed 200 of these cards, and they say, "Race, your thoughts, 6 words, please send." And the idea was to take this really complex topic and say, "You only get 6 words. Tell me what you think." And it could be a story, it could be a memory, it could be a triumph or a lament, whatever it was, but you only got 6 words. And I distributed these postcards wherever I went. At first, it was mainly in the tight area that I was in the Northeast before I started traveling. And of the original 200 cards, about 30% came back to me. People actually went, found cards, put postage on them, wrote their 6 words, and sent them to me. And that's a pretty good yield. And so I went to my publisher. I got my publisher to print thousands of cards. And I was the person that I work with that I think your team got to know, Melissa Bear. We've been together almost 15 years working on this project. She was finding printers in every city I went to. When I was in Salt Lake City, she found a printer there. When I was in Sacramento, she found a printer there. And so everywhere I went, I was printing these cards, and I became the Pied Piper of postcards. I was leaving these. If you stayed in a hotel room and you needed a good word at night and you picked up the Bible at the Marriott Hotel in Sacramento, out would fall one of my postcards. If you were at the sugar station, in a Starbucks someplace, you'd see a postcard. I was sticking them in restaurant menus, and people were sending them back to me. And there are 2 reasons that I knew I had to keep going. One, is the intention of that act, because we were, by that time, kind of onto email, but people were finding a postage stamp, finding a mailbox, finding a pen, and then writing their 6 words and sending them to me, and the things that people were saying were so vibrant and honest and candid and open that I thought, "I have to keep going with this. Something is going on." I hit a taproot. People saying things like, "You said dirt, so I scrubbed. I'm only Asian when it's convenient. She's nothing but poor white trash. Black babies cost less to adopt. She called me Johnny Blue Eyes. Reason I ended a sweet relationship." It just went on and on and on. And I thought, okay, I know I have this other big job that takes 700% of my time, and I'm raising young kids. So my cup is full, but I just have to get a bigger cup because people were were witnessing. They were sharing their stories. And I decided to create a website so it would be public facing and I could share some of what came in my inbox. And then it became this virtuous circle. The more stories we posted, the more stories came back to us. And then they started to come from places I had never visited. A group of soldiers in Afghanistan all sent in their cards digitally, because most of the cards that we collect now are digital. But I still love the postcards because you can see how people think. And we have been doing this for 14 and a half years. It'll be 15 years this September. And when we published the book in January of 2024, we had archived 500,000 stories. We're now past 750. We'll probably be at 1 million by the end of the year. So I created this project based on a mistaken idea. I thought no one wanted to talk about race or identity. And it turns out that a lot of people do. They're just looking for the right kind of space to do this.
Is absolutely it's extraordinary. One of the statements that got me just in the beginning, you mentioned one of them that about being Asian when it's convenient, but I was white until 9/11.
Mhm.
And the other one in the beginning of the book where you said, where it said, "Gay, but at least I'm white." It's like, wow. My question is this: what is there a particular postcard that touched you in a very personal and deep way?
It's a hard question to answer because 'cause I'm in the inbox almost every day, and they all hit me in different ways. I do it because I want to touch the cards. I want to see this. I want to hear the symphony, coming at me. So there are cards that, some of them hit my heart in a soft way. When John Letman sent in 6 words, he is white, his wife is Korean, they live in Hawaii, they're raising their child in Hawaii, and his 6 words were, "My son's not half, he is double." And I just love that. They said, "We're not gonna choose." They want us to check just one box. He will be bicultural, biracial, and not half, but but double, and maybe even more than that, as they look back and see that discover that she's not just Korean and he's white plus, and so I like that thinking, but there are other cards that landed. I mentioned one of them. "You said dirt, so I scrubbed." Ooh. "Then he died in our alley." I don't know if you remember that card, but a little girl who remembered a black man was walking down the street and stopped to smell the laundry that was being hung on a clothesline. Now, I'm old enough to remember clotheslines, and there is a beautiful my mother used to hang the clothes, and they have this very fresh scent, and I guess he just went by and decided, smell that aroma, and someone called the police, and the chase ensued, and he was shot in the alley. And this woman remembers it, all these years later. No one really talked to her about it. So that's one that really stuck with me. Um,
That story really touched me.
yeah.
It just hit.
Yeah.
And then the ending of the story of I knew that it should not have happened. He
Yes.
should not have died that way. It's, whew.
Yes. A child knows when injustice exists, which is another
Mm,
6 words. Last night they burned Roscoe's house. Last night they burned Roscoe's house. Also someone
mm,
who saw injustice, someone who remembers hearing his father crying very loudly because his father had a friend who was in the military, a Tuskegee Airman, I believe it was, and had built his house by hand and was house proud and built a beautiful house, but had built it too close to the line where Black folks were not supposed to live. And they burned the house down. And this grown man remembers his father weeping about his friend Roscoe. And the family never talked to him about it. But again, recognizing this doesn't make sense to a child, and this is what children saw in segregated America and Jim Crow America. So, stories like that hit me. The one that I write about in the book, though, that haunted me was Black babies cost less to adopt. And I wrote a whole chapter
mm,
in the book about that. And it was sent in by a woman named Michele from Covington, Louisiana. And her 6 words were about the child she adopted and learning in the adoption process that the fee associated with adopting a little Black boy was much lower than the fee if she had adopted a white child. And I wound up doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of families, and I use a
mm,
story of one family in um, in that chapter, a white couple that adopted a little Black girl, and I found everybody in the family. I also talked to the birth mother who did not know that her baby
mm,
was discounted. No one had
mm,
told her about that. And it's a beautiful story about a very beautiful and I would say successful adoption. But through that, I was able to look at the beautiful process of adoption and this rather unfortunate aspect of it that is in part to incentivize more Black families to participate in adoption because a lot of Black families participate in foster care and scoop up people in a more elastic sense, but not as many in the formal adoption process. So they use what they call a discount to try to, no one likes that word, but they lower the price to, to try to incentivize more Black families to open their heart and their home. But everybody I talked to, and I did hundreds of interviews for this, everybody I talked to said that 6 words is accurate, and that 6-word story, Black babies cost less to adopt. And they're talking about not buying babies, but the fee structure associated with adoption. That those 6 words and the practice of the reality that if you adopt a white child, the fees are right up here. If the child's blonde, they're
mm,
way up here. If the child's brunette, they're a little bit lower. Asian comes down a little bit. Hispanic comes down a little bit. Um, Latino down a little bit. Black girls comes down a little bit. Black boys is all the way down at the bottom. And then you get skin tones and variations. And they all said that yes is part of an incentive, but it also is a reflection of our values. It tells us
mm.
something in the numbers don't lie. They tell us something about the value that we place on human life in its very earliest stages. And that was very hard to report.
When I came across that particular story, I had to stop
Mhm,
reading,
mhm.
and it just sat with me for a while. The value of Black children in economic terms, and hmm, I'm
And
curious,
can
what
I just say one thing? Because it really messed
Mhm,
me up. Because at the same time, I was researching the chapter that I write on how Germany remembers its past and how America doesn't.
mm,
So I was also doing some research on slavery, and so in the economics of slavery, Black children were extremely valuable. I mean, that's
mm,
the sort of perverse kind of nature of this. That at one time when we were seen as labor, the potential, and because in the South their hands were so small, they could easily pick cotton. They could go in and do some of the more difficult work. So when you look at the numbers and the economics, and you attach that to um, our worth ethic. We talk about our work ethic. We need to have a conversation in this country about our worth ethic
Mm, mm.
and what we value and why we place these values on people and how we get to a point where we can live up to our creed.
There's something about this project and this work because academics have attempted to share the challenge of race, the original sin of race, the pain, the triumph, and the tragedy in and around navigating a social construction. But what you've been able to do is pull back a layer
Mm,
and another layer and another layer where we are able to settle into stories and many of them you never think to frame or understand things from a particular perspective. The piece about being no, I'm not mixed, I'm albino.
mhm,
That story, the story of I wish, I'd hoped that my son would be a girl
mm,
uh, because of the challenges of black boys, or you're pretty for a black girl. That I think every parent should have this book in their library and have conversations around it. What did you discover about America's identity?
mhm. Well, I discovered I'm gonna answer a slightly different question. I discovered that our conversations about race are incomplete. Um, when we have a conversation, which is why I am glad you asked about identity, because when I talk about race, I usually talk about race and identity as co-joined
Mhm.
ideas. Because when we have a conversation about race, the notion is that we're talking about those people. That's a conversation that's by, for, or about Black people, maybe people of color, but usually Black people. And one of the things that surprised me in doing this work is in the almost 15 years that I've been doing it, in the majority of the years, the majority of the stories have come from white Americans. And that shocked me. I did not when I put the basket on the table and I called it the Race Card Project, I wanted to talk to everybody, but because most conversations, as I said, about race are, led by Black people, we've all been to the diversity trainings, when we still did that. Um, and you have a conversation and everyone looks to the Black person in the room and says, "What do you think?" I mean, it's the idea is that we carry that conversation. So I thought that that's what I would hear, and I had no idea that I would be embarking on a decade long plus odyssey of listening to white Americans talk about race. But what it helped me understand is that our conversations about race are often incomplete, that there are a lot of times when we don't include white America. They're bystanders. They don't have to participate. They're not even included in the conversation. As a journalist, we don't, when something happens, we call certain people. We call you and say, can you help us understand what happened at Mother Emanuel? We don't ask, white Americans to respond to maybe the heartbreak that they experience, maybe the um, vertigo that they experienced trying to understand the syllable of hate that led Dylan Roof to do that. I mean, we just don't, ask white Americans to participate in the same way. And so that was an epiphany for me when I realized we need to figure out how to do that, how to have more inclusive conversations, and also how many people are standing at the edges saying, "Hey, what about us?" People who are Latino, people who are indigenous, people who are saying, I have skin in the game also. Um, I've learned a lot of big epiphanies and small things, like, the notion of being American and how freighted that is and how much gatekeeping there is around the idea of someone who is fully American or truly American or authentically American. I've learned that for some people, we think that when we see evidence of cross pollination in terms of race and ethnicity and religion, as people intermarry, that we see that as a sign of progress, and it is. I'm old enough to remember a pre-loving period. Um, it is a sign of progress, but also it is an opening to a more complicated chapter also, because there are certain tensions inside households. There are certain power dynamics inside families. There are certain um, questions that people face about who do I accept and who do I reject when I check that box, or when I decide, how I'm going to wear my hair, or when I decide where I'm going to go to college. Am I rejecting one culture by for now embracing this culture? And I realize that there are hidden there are hidden truths and hardened narratives that I just could not get to as a journalist, but that I was allowed to see by basically passing the mic to America. And the New York Times described this work as an open mic gone right, like a town hall with an open mic gone right, because I stepped back and let Americans speak their truth. And that has been an education for me that has been more valuable than much of what I learned around race and race, the constructs of race in a college classroom or in a newsroom, by letting people speak their truth, often saying things that I don't agree with, often saying things that give me indigestion, often saying things that also allow me to see new worlds. In the book I describe it when I was a kid driving around the neighborhood on my bike, where I grew up in a working class neighborhood. No one had air conditioning, and so everyone kept their windows open at night and kept the windows open all day because my father's from Alabama. He certainly wasn't going to put air conditioning in the house in Minnesota. That was just a non-starter. So people had the windows open, and in the summer you heard people live out loud. You knew who got the Jackson 5 album. You knew who was trying out for the choir. You knew whose marriage was a little bit rocky because you could hear everything through the windows. And that's what this book is like. It's like walking through America's neighborhoods, even the ones that you've never been to, even the ones that you're not welcome in, but you're still able to move through those areas and the windows are all open and you can hear people live out loud.
That you struggled with whether to publish.
Any stories that I struggled with whether to publish? I The Black Baby story, because,
Hmm.
I talk about it in the book. Before I had published that in the book, I did an NPR piece on this notion of the sliding scale, and I was in Oregon at Lewis and Clark College, and a young lady walked up to me and she says, "I know what you did. That story that you did, you know, I know what you did, and I know how it made me feel." And I still get ice. I still feel because it was just, ooh, when a young person pulls you up and they have justification to do it, it just doesn't feel good. So I wrestled with that. I wrestled there's a story in there, I wondered if I should include the story about white trash, but then I realized the words white trash come in the inbox over and over and over again, not with other people saying that person is just white trash. It's usually someone who is white saying that is used against me. That is something that people say about me, and it's usually other white people, and it's often people I know. It's, the people I work with, they whisper that about me because I go to college now, but this is where I come from. It's other people in my family who have climbed a few rungs up the ladder and they look back at me and they say, "You're nothing but poor white trash." And I decided to go ahead and publish the story about Tracy Hart that's in the book, who says, "Yes, I'm tobacco picking white trash." This is a white woman named Tracy who I've interviewed over almost 10 years now, repeatedly. And she's an opera singer. She works for the World Bank. She's very well educated. She travels the world helping them helping build water systems all over the world. But she's from Appalachia. She's from a very poor community where they did not have running water. And for many of her family members still don't have running water. And when she goes home, um, they see her as Sadidi. They see her as someone who thinks she's all that. They don't relate to her. Her first husband was Jewish, her second husband was Middle Eastern. That just blows her family's mind. What are you doing? What did the big city do to you? We don't recognize you anymore. Your values are not our values. Um, she rides this escalator up and down, and I decided to include it because it's so common, and I know she's not alone in her story. But also because when you listen to her, and if you read the book, the audiobook also is available, and you hear many of the people tell their own stories. So when you either read the story or listen to the audiobook and you're listening to Tracy talk about this, she talks about how her family, thinks she's all that. You're all that, but she's also the fixer. She's the one they call when they need a eulogy written. She's the one they call when they can't afford a lawyer, but could you help us with this? She's the one they call when they have a problem with their lease. And I think a lot of people of all backgrounds, whether you're a first generation Italian to go to college. I know if you're a black folks who come from certain communities and matriculate into other communities and ride that escalator back and forth. There are whole movies made about that. If you saw what was it, the Johnsons movie with um, Steve Harvey, and when he went home, Roscoe, I can't remember the name of the movie, but it was all about someone who was a famous radio person who goes home and he's all fancy now. And his family can't relate to him, and he is, has a come to Jesus moment about his values. That I knew other people would see themselves in her. And that's part of the value of listening through the window to another household, because your life is very different, but some of us are still struggling with some of the same things.
Mm. The beauty of the book is also language. When you mentioned white trash, the idea that you put white in front of trash in order to create this statement that is painful, and removing that in a particular way means that whiteness doesn't fit in there. You're pretty for a black girl. Those stories were just over and over and over and over. And um, hearing those stories from people in my family, someone saying that to my daughter, uh, just is deeply painful. But this idea of we rest in the imagination in a particular way around ideas of race and identity. What what surprised you about language that you heard and how people talk about identity and race?
Um, I answer that in just a minute, but I'm glad you brought up "You're Pretty for a Black Girl," because I want this project to hold a mirror up to America when it comes to race and identity. And because we're talking about race and identity, you aren't always going to like what you see. And the reason there are so many photos in this book is I wanted you to see the faces of people who were telling these stories. Since they shared their photos with me, I wanted to share them with the audience. And in particular, in that chapter, I have so many people who have sent some version of "You're pretty for a dark skinned girl. You're cute to be, so dark." I mean, some version of that. Um, and I wanted to include it in the book, and I wanted to do the repetition, as you mentioned, so people would understand just how often this lands in the inbox. And I wanted you to see photographs of these women so that you would understand they are beautiful, full stop. Not because they're light skin, dark skin, straight hair, curly hair, nappy hair that reaches through the sky like an exclamation point. Doesn't matter. They're beautiful. And I wanted people to understand the notion that beauty is given to all of us. Beauty standards are different than beauty. And that we get hung up on beauty standards, and to understand, and hearing those stories repeatedly, that much like white trash, they most often hear that from someone in their love circle. It's an aunt that says it. It's a grandma that says it. It's when you go home for the holidays. It's somebody in your dorm room that says it. It's and so um, I wanted to include that. And that's part of the power of language and the repetition, how we become accustomed to something. I talk about lynching and how we talk about lynching, and we kind of use it, the person was hung out to dry, or the language of that, and it loses the power of what the history represents. I've learned that there are certain words that are loaded in some spaces, like the word privilege. A lot of people get really hung up on the word privilege and who has it and who doesn't. And they feel like, I don't have a lot of money. I have to decide at the end of the month whether I buy meat or medicine. How am I privileged? And yet we live in a country where absolutely our laws gave privileges to certain people and robbed other people of that. I've had deep, examinations through this project of the names we give ourselves. My birth certificate says Negro, and how we've traveled as people over time and the names that we adopt and how they sometimes take on power and how we give up power. In the chapter where I write about so called internment camps, because of this work, I now use the phrase so called internment camps because when I talk to the descendants of people who were placed in those camps, internment camp is just too soft a word for them. They were imprisoned against their will. We're having this discussion right now in America, with the War Powers Act being used. Uh, I learned that the internment camp was, to call it an internment camp was, I didn't understand that. That was a point of contention for the children of people who were picked up, swept up, sent to places in Arkansas and Wyoming and Idaho and lost everything as a result. And again, these are not things that I would have heard in polite conversation. These are things that I might not have heard, during the very um, sort of muscular journalism that I try to do on a daily and weekly basis. I only learned it by getting inside of these conversations that people allowed me to access because they shared their stories in the glow of a computer screen. And it reminds me of the importance of creating spaces where we can listen to each other and creating spaces where we can tell stories because as proud of the work that I do as a journalist, and I think it is, journalists do write the first draft of history, that first draft is often incomplete, because of the access that we have, which is usually limited. You know, um, this is a case where people set the agenda and they have decided what is important to them, and in in addressing that, they put the story on the table and they help me understand how they use language to hide sometimes. How the difference between saying someone is Persian or Iranian. It's really complicated. The difference in saying someone is Latino or Hispanic or Chicano or Latinx. Really complicated, really complicated, and different in different parts of the country. That conversation is very different in the border along Texas than it is in the very large Latino population in, say, North Carolina. And um, I I would not have a strong grasp, and I'm still learning every day. I do not purport to be an expert, but I would not have a strong enough grasp on this um, if I hadn't done this work.
Mm. There was someone who it was in the chat would like to know where they can get the digital postcards.
You can contact us at theracecardproject.com, and we have packs of cards that we can send people. And we want very much for this project and this book to be of use. So that you had mentioned, I'd love if every household had it. I know that's not going to happen, but if you do have it, we want people to, leave it on the coffee table, leave it on the kitchen table, leave it in a space where people can open it up. Because almost every page you will open up and find an interesting story. I write essays in the book, but there are hundreds of individual 6-word stories, often with the backstory. And it's like wading through America, all singing and telling their own story in their own octave. And we have been trying to support communities that are using the book and the race card project and the process of coming together to first discuss someone else's story because it's sort of an anthropological trip. If you're first going to talk about other people's stories, it's easier than to come back and talk about your own. I mean, that's what Zora Neale Hurston did. We know her as an author, an iconic author, but she was an anthropologist. and she would travel through Florida, and she would go to Eatonville and take a story from Eatonville, and then she'd go to the next town, and she'd go to Port Lucie, and she'd share the stories that she got from Eatonville, and then they would tell their stories because she had rendered the pot with other people's stories. And so that's what we try to do, with this work. I was just in South Carolina, and I learned that 18 different households on the same evening on a Saturday night, 18 different households in different parts of the city in Charleston, Black folks, white folks, a group of Asian that all worked at the same university, very diverse group, different parts of the city, were all having dinner parties, and they were all going to discuss the book and do the race car project. And I'd heard about it, and I flew myself to Charleston and crashed the party because I thought, if you're going to do this, I want to be a part of it. I want to like actually see what you're doing. And so we made sure that they had cards and they were able to, do
Mhm.
this. Um, but even if you wind up doing it on 3x5 recipe cards, as long as you are able to share the story. But we do have cards that we can share with you, and we have conversation packs and things that we can do to help lubricate the conversation and make it a little bit easier.
And I want to offer this final question for you. What is the future of the project? What do you envision 5, 10 years from now this project will be, what it will do?
My friends, including 2 friends that we share, Eric and Cheryl, have, long encouraged me to think bigger, because I've been just so focused on keeping this project alive, which is, it was my baby and now it's a teenager. It's almost 15 years old, and you know what a teenager's like, they stare at the refrigerator, "What you got to eat?" That's kind of like where this is at, trying to keep track of, this massive archive, but I think it will outlive me. So in the short term, I hope that it is the impetus for conversation, that I hope that it brings people together to have yeasty and perhaps difficult conversations. I would love if it were um, used in more. We've been used in as a focus for art projects in museums. We'd love to be able to do more of that. I envision probably some documentary work around this because some of the stories are so deep and rich. If you read the breadcrumbs chapter, a chapter where 3 different women lied to their children because they were so bottled up about their racial identity that they just couldn't tell their children the truth. There's probably some beautiful documentary work to do around that. But in the long run, and why I say this will outlive me, we are living in a period that will be examined very closely because of the changes that we're experiencing. This is a project that captures American life around this subject that allegedly no one wanted to talk about in a period bookended by Barack Obama and the second presidency of Donald Trump. This period will be examined because of police shootings, because of AI, because of economic tumult, because of global migration, because of climate change, because of our tumultuous politics. And this crazy project, which started in the 3rd floor of my house in the attic and what I used to call the birdhouse, will help us understand this period in a very unique way because most of the stories that people share with us, they're not found in history books. I shared with you what happened to my father. There are multiple stories in this book about returning servicemen there was someone who writes a story about a serviceman who was shot on a school bus, and when I was doing a project with university students around this work, I went and tried to find out where it happened and realized it happens in more than 16 cities, the exact same thing. So my father wasn't the only person who was catching, you know, bullets from the police because they were seeing men in uniform and they weren't used to that. It challenged their notion of what Black men could be and what Black men should be. So I hope that this project will outlive me and will be of service to historians, to anthropologists, to sociologists, to journalists and authors, and all those who want to understand this country that we love and in all of its complexities. And in ways that we can contribute to understanding those complexities outside of the news cycle, outside of history books, where individuals can find the I in history by submitting their story and saying, "This is my truth," and where we can learn a little bit more about America by taking time to examine an archive like this.
Well, I want to say thank you for putting this project together, for creating this book, for taking time out to have a conversation with us. And I want to say again to everyone who is watching, you need to get a copy of our hidden conversation. Our hidden conversation: what Americans really think about race and identity. Have a conversation with your family, with your friends. Have a conversation at your church. Have a conversation in your book club. Have a conversation with your godchild. Have a conversation. Sister Brandy Williams says, Sister Norris, your project is amazing and a major accomplishment. Thank you, Brandy. We are so appreciative of the work that you are doing, and we're thankful that you could be with us this evening for our book notes. I want to give you the final word, Sister Norris. What is something that you would like to share with the village of Trinity at this moment?
The importance of community. We are each other's strength. We are each other's bond. You know that. So I want to remind us that in difficult times, we will find our way forward together, as our ancestors did, as our forebears did, as our parents did, as our children will do. And they are looking to us right now for the power of our example. The last word I want to say though is thanks to you. I follow you on the interwebs. On I love the way that you use your platforms. I love the way that you use your platforms, particularly right now in this moment, to minister to all of us, not just on Sunday, but repeatedly every day and in all ways. I think you are a model. You are more than just a friend. You are a hero to me in the way that you use your life and your platforms, and the power of your words. And you inspire me all the time. And I am so deeply honored to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sister Norris. We are again grateful for you taking time out today, and for all of those who are part of the village. This will also be reposted. We ask that you would share it with other people, get a copy of the book, have a conversation. For those of you who are doing work with young people of different identities, who are not half but double, we invite you to make sure that you get a copy of this book. I believe that it will bless you and bless the community that you are a part of. Let's just have a word of prayer, and we're going to close out at this moment. We are grateful for ancestors, named and unnamed, who were veterans in a war, World War II, and veterans in a battle for human dignity. We are grateful for the vulnerability and authenticity of people who communicate their story. May you bless us that we may have a voice to speak truth to power. So no longer people will use specific terms to marginalize other people, but that we may see the image of God in each and every human being we encounter. We thank you and we give you praise. We offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you for our next book notes. God bless.